Welcome back to the Urban Elements studio. Today we're going to go over again something that we've talked about in the past, and that is finding the center of your design space in the front of the long arm. We went over this once before with fabric on the frame, but today we're going to do it with paper because I don't want you to confuse finding the center of a piece of fabric with finding the center of the space that you can design or quilt in the front of the machine. So I'm going to show you a couple different ways to measure, and I'm going to explain why I think some are wrong and some are right as far as finding the true center of where your space is. And the reason that's important for me is if we don't know where the center of the front of the machine is, where we can actually sew, I don't know how we would begin to line up the center of a panto or our Pantograph Gridz on the back of the machine. A lot of times we have people say that they have lined up their panto at the edge of the table, and then as they advance the quilt, they no longer can sew one portion of the panto. Well, that's because the panto wasn't centered to begin with. So you're encroaching on your space as the take-up lever increases in size with the batting, backing, and top. So if we line up those things to begin with at the true center, as the take-up bar or the batting encroaches on our space, we still have that true center, and we have the space available for our design to sew out beautifully as it was intended to. I know a lot of companies will tell you just go ahead and pop that panto at the bottom of the table and line it up so you know it's flat, but to me that doesn't work. It hasn't worked for a lot of people because we get emails constantly about this, about the design not sewing, and that's because I believe the panto should be in the center of the table, but based on where the center is of the front of the quilt. So we're going to do a couple measurements. I'm going to move the quilt in a little, or the camera in a little bit closer, and I'm going to mark on the paper so that you can see clearly what I'm trying to illustrate without getting confused with a quilt top or with fabric. This is just paper. Now, one of the first things we're going to measure is the actual space between my dead bar and where the start of my bar would be that I would attach my backing to. And if I'm using an OmniGrid ruler, and I'm just going to line it up to the very back of where the dead bar is. And I know you're not going to be able to see this measurement, but I can see it. If we go right to here, this is 26 inches from there to there. So a half of 26 inches would be 13 inches. That would be our center for the entire space. So would that be the center that we would want to align to? If you ask me, I would say no, because this is not the space that the actual long arm can sew in. If I put the long arm in position, and I have to watch because I don't want to tear my paper. If I go back as far as my long arm will go, I can see that the needle position is about 1.5 inches in from the take-up bar, and this would change over time as we're loading on more quilts on the back here. This would get even bigger, but we're just going to go from the basic, and I'm going to go ahead and make a dot right there as far back as the needle could go. And I'm going to go as far forward as I could go. And I want you to note that I do have my ruler table on, but my ruler table is not hitting the bar for the backing fabric. That is not what's stopping it. What's stopping it is the back of the machine won't allow the head to come any far forward. So I don't have to take into account my ruler table. So if I go as far forward as I can here and make a dot, excuse me, this space here is the full scope of what my long arm can move with a quilt loaded on there. This is as far as I could go. So if I measure the space between those 2 points, I'm going to correct my mistake. My in between the 2 dots is 19 1/4. That is how much space I have with the Q24 for my maximum sewing space. I was looking at the wrong line on the ruler. So from the farthest back dot to the farthest forward dot I can sew is 19 1/4, and a half of that is 9.625. So if I mark the center of that, then, and you can see the 13 is a little, doesn't seem that far away, but we got to start further back on that one. So it's only off, the center would have only been off by approximately 1.5 inches, which wouldn't have been the end of the world, but I still want my Pantograph Gridz and my pantographs to be centered based on what the amount of space I have for the actual sewing. I can only sew between here and here. I can't sew between these 2 marks, so I want the center to be marked here. And once I have that, I would go ahead and put my needle down, and I would use the laser light in the back to go ahead and align the center of the back of my table. That's how I would go ahead and line up my pantograph. It's also how I would line up the center of my Pantograph Gridz, which would make it easier for all of the future loading of a panto to go ahead and get those pantos loaded in the center because the grid would already be in place. So I'll go ahead and put the needle down here, and then we can go ahead and go to the back of the machine and go ahead and get the laser set up back there. I have the light off in my studio at the moment just so it will make it a little easier to see my laser light under the bright light of my studio. The table space that I have here in the back is 28 inches from front to back. And what I'm going to do is just find the center of my table, which would be 14 inches. And I'm going to line up my Pantograph Gridz, the center of my Pantograph Gridz, on the center line of my table. My particular Pantograph Gridz is the 16 inch. I have 19 inches, well, 19 1/4. 19 1/4 inches of space up front, so I know I'm never going to sew a 19 inch pantograph. It just would be problematic to getting it to line up. So 16 inches is the maximum that I would ever sew. So I have the 16 inch Pantograph Gridz on my table. I have lined up the center of that line with the center space of the table so that my machine is centered and the Pantograph Gridz is centered. I know as the take-up bar advances and gets fuller and fuller, it's not going to push the head of the machine forward and make me lose my ability to line up the beginning of, the pantograph rows as I go. So now that I have my Pantograph Gridz centered, and how I connect those to the table, I use these command performance hooks. This particular size is called fridge clips. It actually has a photograph of a refrigerator on there in stainless steel. So I attach these to the table, and that's how I hold my Pantograph Gridz in place. You could of course use tape, but in my mind tape is a short-term solution. I've already had my machine for over 1.5 years, and one package of these was enough to go ahead and attach the Pantograph Gridz to the table. If I ever have to remove the Pantograph Gridz for any reason, I leave the clips in place. Those just tell me how to get my grid back in place without having to measure everything again. And the reason why I might take my grids off the table would be to do design boards. Design boards wouldn't need the grid, and I would want to tape those to the table directly, and the grid would be in the place of that. I also kept the paper that came with my grid just because it makes the grid pop a little bit. The Pantograph would do that also, but I just like it. It helps me see better. One thing I will tell you also is that I have a center mark on my table from left to right, and the Pantograph grid has a 0 center point, and it counts from 1 out in each direction. If you do get a grid, you want to make sure not to just trim off one side to fit your table. You have to center the grid from left to right with a 0 mark, and then trim an equal amount off of both sides. So don't mess up your grid when you're installing it, because those numbers counting out can really help you make sure that you have things centered and get things aligned properly. Now that I have my grid in place, all I have to do is align my laser light. Now I like my laser light to be as vertical and straight as possible. The more of an angle it has, the bigger the dot gets, and it can create a little bit of a distortion. So I want to create as little distortion as possible by having my laser light as vertical as possible. So all I have to do is count from either direction to 8, because my grid is 16 inches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is the center, so I can just go ahead and line up my laser light right on that line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Perfectly center. And if I have to, I could adjust it out a little bit, but I'm pretty happy with that. It's almost perfectly straight up and down. I can see it comfortably from the side. It's not shooting off in a really far off angle, and that just makes me feel better as I'm sewing. And keeps the edge of the design as equal to the edge of the quilt as possible. There is going to always be an offset. So that's how I go ahead and center my pantograph on the back. I could just go ahead and lay that in there, and I know that that's going to be my center point, and it makes it a lot easier when I start my project to know exactly where it goes. Again, I know a lot of people tell you just to go ahead and load your pantograph all the way down at the edge of the table. I just have found as the take-up bar is sewing, and you're taking up the quilt top with the batting and the backing, certainly if you're adding 2 battings like a lot of people are doing now for that extra added texture, the take-up bar gets so big that it's pushing the head of the machine further away, sometimes 2 or 3 inches. And if the design is all the way at the bottom of the machine, you're not going to be able to get there anymore, because the head of the machine simply won't go back that far. So that will cause problems in realigning your rows as you advance the quilt, and you won't be able to nest the next design as well as you would have if we use this method. This way we have that allowance at the top and the bottom, so nothing is going to interrupt our ability to nest the rows properly. As I showed you earlier, this space here, from here to here, is where my machine can sew. That's where the top of the needle can get to with the head of the machine, and this is as far as it can go, regardless of the ruler table, because I have my top bar moved so far forward. So this is total of 19 1/4 inches. So I know that a 16-inch pantograph grid will be enough to fit the design that I'm able to sew with my available space. If you had a smaller design space, and you could use the smaller pantograph grids, they come in 3 different sizes. I have the medium one on mine, and it's a one-time purchase, but that is just one of the things that I use to determine what size pantograph grids I would get. as you can see, one of the things that, well, there's two factors that influence how far my machine can move forward and backwards, and both of them are this particular bar. If I move the machine towards the back, the head of the machine hits the bar, but there still is a couple inches between the back of the machine and the needle. If I move the machine all the way forward, it's going to be the back bar of the machine here that limits my ability to move forward. And I can just see that one of my clips is blocking me about 1/4 of an inch, so I might go ahead and move my clip up or down so it's no longer touching that bar. It's not going to save me much, 1/4 of an inch. But it is a factor that I'm going to change. So there are two things that you could do. Also on the bar, this bar can be raised up or down in my particular case, and I like to keep mine as low as possible, because the lower it is, if I could get even 1/4 of an inch lower, I could go back almost another 3/4 of an inch before I hit the needle to the dead bar. So that's one thing. Another thing is the way the frame is put together. When I got my machine, this part of the frame was pushed back, so it was only 3-inch space between here. That meant that this bar hit either my ruler table or the front of the machine. So I moved mine is 7 inches between here and here, and that allows me to have my ruler base on or off and have the machine all the way forward, and the back of the machine will hit this bar before the front of the machine hits my top bar. I am 6 foot tall and I have a 6 foot wingspan, so that means that I can reach pretty far to the back of the machine. So I don't mind having this bar a little bit further forward than what some people might have it at. I can still reach the back of the machine and pull my thread up. And I also, you can see my machine is raised up a little bit higher so that when I'm handling the bars, my arms are pretty much a nice angle, comfortable angle here. I'm not going down too low or too high. But having this bar forward as much as possible allows me to get my maximum sewing space, whether I'm doing a panto or whether I'm doing free motion work or ruler work. This gives me the optimum space while keeping my ruler table on. So that's just one thing that I've done. You can't just naturally assume that because the dealer set up your frame for you that they've really optimized the amount of space that you can have. This frame obviously was designed that it could come out this far. It's perfectly stable, and it just allows me the most space, and I never have to worry. With the paper, I hope you can see here that my ruler base is not touching my front bar here. So nothing is limiting me except the back of the machine, and that is a limitation I cannot change. Everything else I've changed I have so that I have my maximum space. My maximum on a Q24 is 19 1/4. So this was my lesson for today. I just wanted to show you about getting the center of your available space up front, which is why we used paper and not fabric. I don't want you to confuse it with the quilt, because the quilt could roll forward and backwards. This is always going to be the center of my design space that I could use up front. That doesn't matter if I'm using a pantograph, whether I'm using a design board, ruler work, or if I'm doing free motion quilting. This space right here, that spot, is the center of the forward and back of how my range of motion is for my machine. I've used that information to help line up the laser light for the center of my Pantograph Grid in the back, which would help me line up my panto in the back. That way, as the quilt advances and the take-up bar gets fuller, it's not going to alter how far back my design can go, because I'm not going to be sewing back there. I'm going to be sewing my design more to the front. Even if you're just doing pantos and you're not even worried about the back, this moves the space that you're sewing closer towards the front. So if you're pulling up the thread or whatever, it's a little bit easier for you to get to. That's your center range. That's your comfort zone. So that was why it was important for me to show you that today. Some people may find this useful and some people may not find it useful. We all have ways of doing things that are comfortable for us. This is just something that I've learned and I wanted to pass it on to you. So I want to thank you for stopping by today. And if you have any comments, leave them in the comment box below. Hopefully they're good ones.